You know what I love? Finesse fishing. Why? Because quite frankly, it's a great way of catching fish. But today I'm going to talk about something that I refer to as ultra finesse fishing. Really, the goal of today's video is to explore a couple different techniques that are going to hopefully help me and you catch fish this coming year. To be honest with you, I wanted to go fishing today, but the problem was I went out to my trout stream and it was completely blown out. We got a bunch of rain and quite frankly, that thing is just unfishable right now. So why not sit here and ramble about fishing? Also, I have my old 5-minute fish talk mug. Coffee, baby. Let's go. I don't need any more coffee, but I'm gonna drink it. I feel like something's missing. Okay, that feels a lot better right there. All right, before I get into the techniques that I wanted to talk about today, let's define ultra finesse fishing. As you can see, I'm holding two fishing poles right here. They're both spinning rods. This one is a 5.5 foot ultralight. This one is a 6'10" medium light bass rod. Both of these rod and reels catch me a ton of fish. This one's for ultralight fishing, this one's for finesse fishing. So really what I mean when I say ultra finesse fishing, it's basically if ultralight fishing and finesse fishing were to have a baby. You know, finesse fishing is really the art of fishing light gear and subtle presentations for bass. And then ultralight fishing can be fished for pretty much any species, but it's basically using an ultralight rod with light line and light gear. So basically when I say ultra finesse, I mean taking a traditional finesse bass technique and going even lighter. Almost as light as what ultralight would be. So today I'm going to show you like 5 different techniques that I'm excited about, but I've got a lot of ideas up in this here noggin, and throughout the next year, you're probably going to see me experiment with a lot of different techniques. I can't say that all the stuff that I'm going to show you today is brand new. A lot of it's just kind of improvised techniques, but some of it I feel like is pretty new, pretty unique, and I'm very excited to play with it. Okay, let's stop rambling about it. Let's get into some of the techniques that I'm excited about. First up, we have what I'm going to call a micro split shot rig. Now, to tell you the truth, a split shot rig has probably been around since they invented split shot weights, and basically all it is you put a split shot above your hook and then you fish a weightless plastic on there. And so you've got this tiny little weight that's gonna pull it down, and you're gonna get a really subtle presentation. Now, the only reason that I think that this is gonna be a little bit different than how people would traditionally fish it is I'm gonna go even smaller on plastics, I'm gonna go smaller on hook, and I'm gonna go smaller on split shot. And so this will end up being like a happy medium between a traditional split shot rig and then something that's more of an ultralight multi-species rig. As far as baits go on this thing, I feel like 2-inch swim baits, tiny flukes, little weightless worms, lots of different little tiny plastics on there. It's gonna be really unique. Anything from 2.5 all the way up to 4 inches long. I don't know, I just really like that action of a split shot. I like the fact that that weight sinks first and then you could put a buoyant plastic behind it and just get a super slow fall. If you're fishing around weed beds, if you're fishing around docks, this kind of presentation I feel like is going to be deadly. Okay, so I clearly didn't reinvent the wheel with this technique. This is something people have been using for years, like I said. That being said, I'm super excited to experiment more with it this year because it's just something that I personally haven't fished much. Let me ask you this, do you use a split shot rig? And if you do, drop a comment below with some of the baits that you like most. I'd be interested to hear. Okay, the next presentation that I want to go ahead and talk about is, again, it's not something that I've created. This has been around for years and years and years, but I want to take it and I want to make it even smaller and more finesse. And that, my friends, is a drop shot. Throughout the next year, I think what I'm going to try to do is do a little bit more of a micro drop shot. What I want to do with my drop shot is actually use even lighter weights. We're talking about 1/16 ounce. In a lot of cases, I might actually take a split shot and literally just clamp it to it because it's basically the same thing as a drop shot weight. And then with regards to baits, I want to fish stuff like this, just a little tiny 2-inch plastic. Stuff like this is still gonna catch me plenty of bass, but I think what's cool about it is it might open up the potential of catching multi-species. For me, half the fun of ultralight fishing is the fact that you really never know what you're gonna catch. Well, with ultra finesse fishing, you're probably mostly gonna catch bass, but it's gonna open up the door to catching crappie and catching big bluegill and catching all sorts of other species. So I think that's gonna be a lot of fun to experiment with. And quite frankly, I think a micro drop shot is gonna be such a fantastic bait to throw to catch a lot of different species. This particular technique is probably something I'm going to focus on a lot when the fish are just hovering above the bottom, maybe hovering above a weed line, or maybe it's the dog days of summer and they're very, very lethargic. Okay, the next technique is something that I personally have never seen done before. It's not to say that someone hasn't tried it, but for me, this is completely new. I drew it up on a piece of paper and I'm like, you know what, that actually looks pretty good. I really don't know what to call it, but it's basically a hybrid between the split shot rig and a drop shot rig. So basically I tied a swivel on and I left my tag end, and then I went ahead and put a drop shot weight, and then on the other side of that swivel I tied a short leader and just put a little nose hook on a tiny little swim bait. Again, I have no idea if anybody's ever fished something like this. I would have to believe somebody's played with it before, but for me, it's brand new. I think this could actually be super cool for presenting something very similar to a drop shot, more horizontally. A drop shot is such a great bait. You can use it horizontally, but I would say it's at its best when you're fishing it vertically. Well, what makes me excited about this is it's gonna be very similar to a drop shot, but you're gonna be more effective with a horizontal presentation. Until I get out there and try it, I don't know how this is gonna work. There's a chance that that tag end right there just gets tangled up all the time and it might become a headache to fish. Who knows? The reality is, I've never tried it before, so I can't say for certain, but I guarantee you this. In future videos, you can count on me to try this rig because I think it looks pretty darn cool. I'm definitely gonna experiment with that length of leader. For this is just a visual representation, but I'll probably go with more of a 12 to 14 inch leader to that weight, and that'll allow it to kind of go down in the weeds, but the bait, I'll use something very buoyant and it'll ride above those weeds, and I'll be able to just drag it, and that thing's just gonna ride right above the weeds, nice and slow, nice and finesse, and it's probably gonna catch me a ton of fish. We've gone over 3 techniques now. I have very little experience fishing those last 3 things that I talked about. The next 2 techniques that I'm gonna talk about are 2 things that I've already experimented with, and they showed extremely good potential. These are probably the ones I'm personally most excited about. This one is a micro Ned Rig. You've seen me throw micro Ned Rigs in the past, but I really haven't fished them a ton. So as I've explained 1,000 times, a typical Ned Rig is a 1/16 ounce jig head with a 3-inch plastic. Well, what I refer to as a micro Ned Rig is really gonna be no larger than a 1/16 ounce jig. So in a lot of cases, I'm probably gonna throw a 1/32 ounce mule jig or even a 1/64. And then when it comes to the plastic, I'm talking anywhere from 1.5 to 2.5 inches. That's even smaller than a Ned Rig. So the point is, you've got a Ned Rig at about 3 inches. A micro Ned Rig is basically cutting it down in size and actually downsizing your jig head. This one happens to be like a Z-Man Tickler's rigged backwards. This is like a 2-inch bait right here, and it's got appendages at the front. When you're talking about a bait like this on a 1/32 ounce mule jig, this thing's gonna have an extremely slow rate of fall. A lot of times when fish are either suspended or they're just pretty lethargic, a slow rate of fall can really be the key to drawing a bite. And that's really what excites me about this rig right here. This particular bait is just one example of many that I'm gonna play with. I've cut 3-inch stick baits in half in the past and used about a 1.5-inch chunk of plastic. This year I've certainly got more ideas. I've got 1,000 plastics, and there's so many different ways you can modify those plastics to make them viable for a micro Ned Rig. The one thing that's really gonna be constant about my micro Ned Rigs is the fact that they're gonna be right in that 2-inch range from a plastic standpoint. Anyways, like I said, I've fished with micro Ned Rigs in the past, so I'll go ahead and link a video in the description below so you can check that out if you haven't seen it yet. But every time I use something like this, it's great for multi-species and it catches plenty of bass, so I'm a big fan. This last technique is very, very similar to what I just showed you with the micro Ned Rig, but it's just a little bit modified, and it's honestly what I'm most excited for this year. And that, my friends, is a micro jig and worm. Very similar to the micro Ned Rig I just showed you, but it's just a little bit different profile. You're taking a typical Finesse plastic. This is 4 inches long, but you're placing it on a 1/64 ounce mule jig. This literally has a number 8 hook. We're talking a tiny hook. My good man Mark and my good man Guillermo out west crush bass on this exact rig. This is a Yamamoto cuttail rigged on a 1/64 ounce mule jig, and this thing's freaking deadly. I've only personally fished with it once, but it showed awesome potential. I caught a bunch of white perch on it actually, but I did catch a bass. I actually caught a bluegill, and then in addition, I was looking at it underwater, and the thing looks insane. Unfortunately, this year I pretty much ran out of time to bass fish more. If I would have had more time to bass fish, I probably would have played with this rig a lot more. The reality is, I'm nothing but excited about this. You know, a jig and worm has been around for years and years and years, just like a lot of these other rigs I've showed you, but there's not very many people that I've ever seen in my life using a small jig like this on a plastic like this. The Yamamoto cuttail is definitely what my man Mark uses, and this is probably going to be my top plastic for this particular rig. That being said, I'm definitely going to do some experimenting. Stuff like this. This is another Finesse worm. This one's actually one of those Strike King KVD's perfect plastic, so it's more of that like Elastec type feel. So I'm curious how this will work as well, because it's going to be extremely durable. Probably be able to fish with this forever. So you can count on me to play with different Finesse worms, but ultimately the point of this rig is using a 1/64 ounce mule jig with a Finesse worm. I think what makes this rig look so good in the water is the fact that the hook shank is so short. If you have too long of a hook in a bait like this, you actually negatively impact the motion of that tail, because your hook shank might be going to middle of the plastic, so your range of motion is only from here to here. When you use a smaller hook like that, you've got a range of motion from here to here. Before I conclude today's video, I suppose some of you are probably curious as to what gear I intend to throw all these techniques on. Honestly, I'm just gonna go ahead and throw them on my Ned Rig rod. I think what I might do is downsize my leader to a 6-pound fluorocarbon just to get a little bit more action out of these baits and to just cut down on visibility of line. But ultimately, I think the Ned Rig rod will do just fine. So to conclude today's video, ultimately, ultra finesse is not going to be for everyone. If you're a competitive tournament angler, you're probably not going to need to rely on techniques like this to win a tournament. That being said, I have a story that I think a lot of you will like. I distinctly remember one story from my college fishing experience that absolutely shaped a lot of who I am as an angler and a lot of what I stand for. So get this, when I fished at the collegiate level for Kansas State University, we had a faculty advisor, and the Ned Rig was not a big thing at that time. There was a handful of guys fishing it, but realistically it didn't have much love in the industry. So this was at a time where I was somewhat new to Ned Rig fishing. I was a freshman in college actually, and I started throwing the crap out of it, and I realized that the Ned Rig crushes bass. So because I was trying to do my part on the team and expose my fellow anglers to techniques that I think had potential, I showed our faculty advisor the Ned Rig, and I was like, man, this thing's killing it for me. I think this has really good potential. And this is the part that absolutely cracks me up. Our faculty advisor at the time said back to me, it might work a little bit around the shad spawn, but it's never gonna win any tournaments. Boy, was he wrong. The Ned Rig absolutely exploded, right? And it's won hundreds of thousands of dollars for tournament anglers. So what's the moral of that story? The moral of the story is simple. You should never assume you know everything about fishing, and you should always continue to experiment as an angler. That's one of my personal favorite things as an angler. I love trying new techniques. I like experimenting on the water, and even though sometimes I might not catch as many fish, at least I'm constantly learning, and that is absolutely something that I'm going to continue to do on this here YouTube channel. I gotta believe that there's still some techniques out there that have yet to be discovered that are gonna absolutely crush fish. And hey man, if I can help discover them, I'm all about that life. I've definitely rambled long enough to where my coffee is now cold and it's gross, so that's probably a good indication that that's enough rambling for today.